meeting today because I've known Mitchell Bard for a long time, and it's always very interesting to listen to what he has to say. Mitchell Bard is the executive director of the American-Israeli Cooperative Enterprise, AICE, and I think that whoever is involved with Israel studies owes him a lot. I don't think that there's anybody in the United States that supported, helped, assisted, strengthened the entire field of Israel studies as Dr. Bard has done in the last 10 years or so. Through his work, tens, by now it's probably hundreds, of Israeli lecturers came to the United States to give courses in many universities, and he's really a major figure in developing the field of Israel studies. But beyond that, he's an academic as well, and he's a prolific writer. He wrote 18 books, and this one is the last one. I won't go into the very long list of books that he published. I'll just mention two of them. One of them is In Israel Studies. That's an anthology that he co-edited with David Nachmias. He wrote an interesting book called Will Israel Survive 2 or 3 years ago. Another book on 48 Hours of the Kristallnacht, and many others. I suggest that you'll Google his name and find all these books that he wrote. Another thing that he did, which is very important, and I find it very useful, is the Jewish Virtual Library. And for the students, I really recommend you to go and see it on the web, because it has a fantastic collection of papers, articles, books on very many topics that are related to Jewish studies and Israel studies. Dr. Bard has received his BA in economics from the University of California, master's degree in public policy from Berkeley, and PhD in political science from UCLA. So he can look at Israel, the Middle East, the conflict, Zionism, Jews, whatever, in a very wide angle, both economics and public policy and international relations and political science, which makes his perspective very broad. Well, I think that doesn't conclude what I can tell you about him, but for the beginning it's enough. So the floor is yours, Mickey.
Thanks very much, Yoram. Thanks to all of you for coming. Actually, the subject I'm talking about was the subject of my PhD dissertation more than 20 years ago. It's frightening to think. I wrote my first book from the dissertation on domestic influences on U.S. Middle East policy. And it was focused more on the Israeli lobby side. And over the years, as probably most of you know, there's been a lot of attention given to the Israeli lobby, and especially after the book by Walton Mearsheimer, which added to a whole collection of works suggesting that there is an all-powerful Israeli lobby controlling U.S. Middle East policy. And like most works, they completely ignored the possibility or existence of any rival or competitive lobby, the Arab lobby. And in fact, there is an Arab lobby, and I would argue it's a very strong one. And the reason I entitled my book, or subtitled my book, The Invisible Alliance, wasn't to suggest that there's a conspiracy involved with the people who are lobbying on behalf of Arab interests, but mainly because the Arab lobby is largely unseen, gets very little publicity, and so people have very little knowledge of it. You can't go down to H Street and see the headquarters of the Arab lobby, the way you can go down and visit the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, the more or less headquarters of the pro-Israel lobby. So I wanted to focus on the Arab lobby in large part because no one really has written or talked about it very extensively. People have very little knowledge of it. You can actually see that the person who's maybe the most identified with the Arab lobby to those who know about it, a fellow named James Zogby, who said, quote, "There is no Arab lobby." And one of the interesting things is that if if you read Walton Mearsheimer, they say there is no Arab lobby, the oil companies have no influence. One of the things I thought was interesting about Walton Mearsheimer's approach is in many ways it's a very racist portrayal of the Arabs, in that it really suggests that they don't have the wherewithal or the means or the intelligence or whatever to carry on a lobbying campaign. But in fact, it's been a vigorous campaign that dates back before the creation of the State of Israel. It goes back to the 20s and 30s, and that anybody who studies political science certainly would see it as self-evident that there isn't going to be just one interest group lobbying on behalf of an interest. When you look at any public policy in the United States or anywhere else for that matter, there's always rivals between positions on any issue. So the idea that there wouldn't be competing interests on the subject of Middle East policy is counterintuitive. The Arab lobby, sort of the formal definition I gave in my dissertation that I use is this, about formal and informal actors that try to influence opinion or policy on behalf of the Arab cause. This is more or less the way I broke down the Arab lobby. I see it as basically two main pieces. There is a domestic piece, which I'll describe in a second, made up primarily of the Arab Americans, Muslim American groups, anti-Zionist Christians, along with Arabists and some academics and former government officials. And then the other piece is the oil lobby, led by the Saudis, made up of the oil industry, the defense contractors, and these same Arabists. The Saudi lobby is really the most influential, and they date back to the 1930s, where you had a combination of Saudi officials, Arabists, former officials, defense industry people, who are lobbying the U.S. government in a variety of different ways to support their interests. Their primary interest is in support for Saudi Arabia. They have marginal interest in Israel, so that one of the things that people suggest in critiquing my book is they say, well, look, U.S. policy is so pro-Israel, how can the Arab lobby be influential? Well, one of the reasons is that when the Saudis lobby, they very rarely compete directly with the pro-Israel lobby. The only time they really do has been on arms sales. And on those arms sales, the Saudi lobby has actually defeated the Israeli lobby on every one of the occasions. But they haven't had a direct conflict really for about 20 years now, since the mid-'80s, when AIPAC last contested any of these arms sales. So mostly the Saudis are interested in their own concerns. You see, their first and primary objective above all else is to keep the royal heads connected to the royal shoulders. That's the bottom line for everything that the Saudis do, what they're lobbying for. And one of the reasons why they've been so committed to the relationship with the United States is from the very beginning, they understood that the best way to guarantee their physical security was through the United States. And in fact, one of the most interesting things I ran across in the research is, you probably know about the oil embargo in the 1970s, and it's often attributed to the U.S. emergency resupply of Israel during the 1973 war, that this was at least the public justification given for the embargo. But one of the interesting things was, in the documents, one of the Saudis basically said, you see this airlift that the United States is carrying out for Israel? This is exactly why we need to be such a good ally, why we need the United States to be our friend, because only the United States could do what they're doing for Israel for us. And so from the beginning, they've understood that America was a key to their security. Their other interests are they want to maintain our addiction to oil. Basically, they act like drug pushers in a way where they try to ensure that the price of oil never gets so high that the United States will then conserve or invest in alternative sources of energy. The best example was about 2.5 years ago, when oil reached an all-time high of $147 a barrel. You would have thought the Saudis and the other oil producers would have been as happy as could be. They'd want it to go to $200, $300. because they're making a fortune. But in fact, the Saudi oil minister said at the time the ideal price of oil for Saudi Arabia is between $70 and $80 a barrel. Guess what the average price of oil was last year? About $75. And so this is one way that I argue that the Saudis actually undermine our interests by trying to keep us addicted to oil. They're also interested in these other things, but ultimately it's all about their physical security. One of the other differentiating aspects of the Saudi lobby from the pro-Israel lobby is that the Saudis understand there is no Saudi grassroots support. Most Americans don't like Saudi Arabia, according to the polls. There aren't a lot of Saudi Americans in the United States. They really have no way of developing a grassroots lobby to try to lobby the Congress. So what they've done is take the exact opposite approach. They work from the top down. And so, again, one of the reasons I talk about it being an invisible kind of alliance and lobby is that very few people are aware when the Saudi ambassador is meeting with the Secretary of State or when he's meeting with the President. Prince Bandar, for more than 20 years as the ambassador from Saudi Arabia, basically was described as having an open door policy to the White House. He used to play racquetball and tennis with people like George Shultz and Colin Powell and David Jones, and so they were able to influence things more directly from the top. They also, because they don't have any grassroots individuals to lobby members of Congress, what they've had to do is basically buy support. So since 9/11, they've spent more than $100 million on public relations and hired guns to be their lobbyists on Capitol Hill. They've also tried to influence policy by investing in universities. They've given over $130 million to universities. And the problem with the Saudi lobby, from my perspective, is they undermine our values, they undermine our interests, and they ultimately threaten our security. The way they do those three things are, first, in terms of undermining our interests. We have a couple of interests. One is in independence from oil, and as I mentioned, they act as this drug pusher to keep us addicted to oil, so it makes it more difficult for us to gain independence. Another reason that they are undermining our interests is in terms of the peace process. The United States has been trying to promote peace in the Middle East for many years, as you all know, and the Saudis have consistently tried to sabotage it. And one of the more dramatic cases was in the Egyptian-Israeli peace negotiations, where Anwar Sadat told Jimmy Carter, look, one of the keys to this peace working and expanding is support from the Saudis. And Jimmy Carter said, well, the Saudis are going to support me, they love me, they'll do whatever I say, and in fact the Saudis didn't support Carter, they didn't support Camp David, they were leading the effort of the rejectionist bloc of Arab states to ostracize Egypt. And since then, they've also undermined our efforts in peace in a variety of different ways. One is by supporting the PLO, by supporting it during its height of its terror before it recognized Israel, by supporting Hamas, which helped undermine the strength of Mahmoud Abbas and Fatah, by supporting terrorism in general. They undermined the peace. And hopefully, if we have time and I get to Obama's policy, I'll talk about how they've directly undermined his efforts to make peace. The other side, as I mentioned, is the domestic Arab lobby. And one of the reasons that people generally don't see an Arab lobby or don't think there is an Arab lobby that has any influence is because of the fact that the domestic Arab lobby really has very little influence. And what I'm talking about is, again, primarily Arab Americans, Christians who are anti-Zionists, Arabists, Muslim American groups. They have believed that the way to liberate Palestine was through Washington, that they came to understand that the Arab states weren't going to defeat Israel militarily, and the best way, or the best possibility of improving their future, getting their independence, would be if the United States ultimately forced Israel to capitulate to their demands. And so they believed forming a lobby and actively trying to get the United States to pressure Israel is the best way to accomplish their goals. They have a number of problems, though. Go to the next one, I think. Well, first, what are their goals? One of the differences, again, between the domestic Arab lobby and the Saudis or the Israeli lobbies, they're interested primarily in the Palestinian issue. And while they're trying to promote a Palestinian state, if you look at their legislative agenda and what they actually lobby for, it rarely is anything pro-Palestinian. It's almost entirely devoted to anti-Israel activities. That is, they want to cut aid to Israel, they're trying to demonize Israel, condemn Israel for a variety of actions, whether they're merited or not. The focus just has consistently been less on what we can do for the Palestinian people or other Arabs in the region, and more how can we try to drive a wedge between the United States and Israel. The Muslim American groups have become more involved and more proficient in recent years, and one reason they've had a little more success is they've tried to focus a lot more of their attention on anti-discrimination or discrimination against Arabs and Muslims, which is a more uniting belief among Arab Americans. That is, no one's for the discrimination of Arab Americans or Muslim Americans, whereas there's a lot of division over broader Middle East policy. Why is the Arab lobby, the domestic lobby, less influential than the pro-Israel lobby? Well, there are a number of reasons. One is there are very few Arab Americans. There are about 3 million Arab Americans in the United States, and of those 3 million, estimates vary between 40 and 80% are Lebanese Christians. And the Lebanese Christians, by and large, do not agree with the agenda of most of the rest of the Arab Americans. That is, most of them are not very sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, in part because many of them had to leave Lebanon because of what either Palestinians or Muslims did to them or they thought were doing to their country. So there is a very small number of people who are actually committed to the Palestinian issue or Arab issues in general. There are 21 Arab states. So how do you represent, quote unquote, the Arabs? You can't. The Arab states have very different agendas among themselves. They fight with each other over different issues. The people who are descendants or come from those countries share many of those same rivalries and interests. So it's very difficult to have a kind of monolithic position on Arab issues, whereas the pro-Israel community is largely united on its support for a strong U.S.-Israel relationship. There's also the fact that the Arab Americans, or the Arab states rather, have a relatively negative image in the United States. I don't say this in a way of being happy about it, but the reality is there are very serious negative stereotypes towards Arabs, and this plays into the lack of support for Arab causes and also support for Israel. Also, there is the widespread, broad-based support for the United States-Israel relationship among the general public. The last Gallup poll showed that 63% of Americans support Israel, 15% support the Palestinians. So in that context, for a lobby to go to Congress and to lobby against Israel is largely counterproductive because Congress is more responsive to public opinion. This is why the Saudis go above Congress to the executive branch, which is less influenced by public opinion. The Saudis, again, are slightly different because they only have to focus on the interests of Saudi Arabia, and they're not so involved in competing against the Israeli lobby, so they don't have the same kind of disadvantages. Now, the Arabists in the State Department and in some of the other departments also play a key role, especially in trying to influence Middle East policy. And these are some of the basic beliefs of Arabists. The that at root they believe that the most important thing in the United States Middle East policy is guaranteeing the supply of oil, that the way to guarantee the supply of oil is to make the Saudis and other Arab states happy. And how do you make them happy? It's by focusing on the Palestinian issue. It's by having a weaker relationship with Israel. And it's varied over time. It started out in the early 40s with the Arabists basically trying to sabotage the establishment of Israel. Shortly after the establishment of Israel, they tried to do everything they could to reverse it. And gradually they've gotten used to the idea that Israel exists, but have pursued what they believe should be an even-handed policy, which in reality turns out to be more critical of Israel. And the belief also that the Palestinian issue is sort of at the core of everything going on in the Middle East. You may have just seen an interview that was done or a speech that was given by the former National Security Advisor David Jones, which I think very much reflected the Arabist point of view, and I think gives you an insight into the Obama administration, where he basically looked at what's going on in Egypt and said, well, the real problem is the Palestinian-Israeli issue. And I think anyone who looks at what's going on in Egypt, what happened in Tunisia, the rivalries between Iran and Iraq, Saudi Arabia and Yemen, the turmoil within Lebanon, none of that has anything to do with Israel. And yet you still have these State Department Arabists who continue to believe that somehow the Palestinian issue has to be solved in order for things to all improve for U.S. policy in the Middle East. And my argument is it's complete rubbish. Some of the implications of pursuing the Arabist agenda over the years is we've lost respect around the world by appeasing autocrats and by ignoring human rights abuses. I mean, we're seeing this again in Egypt right now, where you hear Egyptians complaining about the hypocrisy of the United States, of why didn't you call for reforms 2 years ago? Why is it only now when we're protesting that you've suddenly decided that Mubarak's not such a great guy? They've weakened the United States by helping us remain addicted to oil. One of the great examples, again, of Arabist thinking was a report written by the State Department expert on energy policy back in about 1968, where he said, look, we have to be concerned with the growing power of oil producers in the Middle East, that they may be able to threaten our oil supplies. We have to begin to think about alternative sources of energy, wind, solar, nuclear. But he concluded none of those alternative sources of energy are feasible, so what we really need to do is change our relationship with Israel. And that, again, is at the root of the thinking of the Arabists. And it never occurred to any of them to say, hey, maybe we should use our political, economic, and military clout to say to the Arabs, we want you to support our interests. It never occurred to them, early in the 40s, for example, to tell the Saudis, we expect you to support our policy on Israel, period. If you want our support, you want us to keep your heads on your shoulders. One of the interesting things about studying the Saudis is that you think about it today, of course, the Saudis have the greatest oil reserves, they have tremendous wealth. It makes sense that the United States would want to keep the Saudis happy. But if you go back to the discovery of oil, the Saudis had not pumped any oil. The United States didn't import a single barrel, didn't need any of their oil for decades, and the Saudis were basically bankrupt. And yet they were able, from the very beginning, to basically blackmail us to go along with their policies. And they would always be very clever about it and make very compelling arguments based on threats that we were also concerned with. So at the very beginning, they said to the Americans, basically, if you don't support us, well, we might give the oil concessions to the British. Then they said in the 1950s, if you don't support us, well, Nasser may take over the oil, or we may align with him. Then they said, if you don't support us, we'll go to the Soviets. I mean, here, one of the classic paradoxes of U.S. Middle East policy is we were pro-Saudi because the Saudis were supposed to be so anti-communist because of communism being such an anathema to an Islamic state, and yet the Saudis would threaten us with going to the Soviets. And they ultimately did go to the communists, for example, when the United States wouldn't sell them all the arms they wanted, they turned to the Chinese and bought weapons from them. So even at the height of the Cold War, where they're saying they're anti-communist allies, they were willing to do it. And now you can be sure that when they talk to the Obama administration and they say, we need $60 billion worth of arms, or we need your support, it's because of the threat from Iran. So they always have some compelling reason to basically extort what they want from us. Now, briefly, the easiest way to disprove Walter Mearsheimer's entire thesis is with two words: Dwight Eisenhower, or two others, Jimmy Carter, or George Bush, or actually Barack Obama. Because if you look at any of the administrations, some more extreme than others, you can see that the Israeli lobby did not influence their policy, or had marginal influence, or the policies were often very critical of the Israeli lobby. And one of the best examples is the Eisenhower administration, which said from the very beginning, we're going to make our policy as if there's not a single Jew in America. They believed that partition was a mistake, at least State Department Arabists did. John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, believed that they needed to change the policy toward Israel because of the resentment it was creating throughout the Middle East. And that Israel, they said, was a millstone around their necks. One of the Arabists was an out-and-out anti-Semite, Herman Byrod, who told Eisenhower he should go onto television to try to break the back of the Zionists. Now, what were the objectives of the Eisenhower administration? Well, they were trying to cultivate Nasser. We offered to build the Aswan Dam. They were trying to build up the Saudis as I think they used the term the Pope of the Middle East. They wanted the Saudis to be their principal ally in the region, and they wanted to marginalize Israel because they thought it was hurting their relations with the Arabs. So this was the basic attitude, completely the opposite of what the pro-Israel community would have wanted. During the Suez War, the Eisenhower administration basically took out the Walt Mearsheimer playbook and tried it out, where because of the anger over the Israelis, British, and French going to war, they were afraid of oil embargo. They were afraid that this would create conflict with the Soviet Union. And so what did Eisenhower do? He imposed sanctions on Israel. He threatened all sorts of extreme measures of cutting off aid, cutting off military support, voting against them at the United Nations. Did everything that most of the harshest critics of Israel now say the Obama administration should be doing to Israel, to impose penalties to force Israel to capitulate to their demands. Dulles also actively solicited the support of the Arab lobby. You know, there's this notion that lobbies are the ones who actively go and are doing the persuading. But it also works the other way as well, where Dulles was actually going out looking for people who would help sell their policy to the American people. Ultimately, you know, some people would argue it was a great success because, thanks to all of this pressure, Israel did in fact withdraw from the Sinai. One of the interesting things, though, is, this is getting ahead of it a little bit, is that despite the fact that the State Department believes that you need to lean on the Israelis in order to make the Arab leaders happy, they actually understand that it doesn't make any difference. And this was one of the most, one of the more dramatic steps, where they said that it doesn't even matter. Even if the Israelis do what we want them to, there's no reason to think that the Arabs are going to respond positively. Go ahead. And this was an interesting case study. After the '56 war, the king of Saudi Arabia went to the Americans and said the Israelis are interfering with the pilgrims going to Mecca through the Red Sea. Make them stop. So the Americans went to the Israelis and said, the Saudis are complaining. The Israelis said, we're not doing anything to the pilgrims. The State Department said, well, stop anyway. So then the king wasn't satisfied. He said, well, get the Israeli ships out of the Red Sea. It's an Arab Gulf. So the Americans went to the Israelis and said, can you tie up your ships in Eilat? And the Israelis said, but our ships are, we just fought a war and you supported the idea of freedom of navigation. This isn't an Arab lake, it's an open sea, that there should be freedom of navigation. The State Department said, yes, we know, but tie up your ships anyway. The king still wasn't satisfied. The king came back again and said, we want the Israeli ships completely out of the Gulf. State Department goes to Abba Eban in the Israeli Foreign Ministry again, says, the king's still complaining. And finally, Eban says, what do you want from us? Even if we do this, is it going to make any difference? And the State Department official basically admitted, no, it wouldn't make any difference at all. And again, it's a theme of the Arabists of the State Department. It's even when they know their policies aren't going to make a difference, they try to insist on Israel doing them anyway. You could skip this one. After attempting to do all of these things in his first term and the beginning part of the second term, it became clear even to the Eisenhower administration that their policy was completely flawed. That it turned out that what the previous slide had showed, that the Saudis were not reliable, that rather than being allies against Nasser, they actually went to Nasser to befriend him, that they were too weak to be a reliable ally or a strategic ally, and that much of what they had done to Israel had been counterproductive. And so in the end, in the late 50s, 58, when Lebanon and Jordan became threatened with uprisings that were going to topple pro-Western regimes, the United States had to send in troops, and they went to the Saudis and said, can we fly over Saudi Arabia to send in our troops? And the Saudis said, jump in the lake. And the Israelis said, of course you can fly over our country. And this was one of the first indications and the first examples of how Israel could be a strategic asset to the United States. And that's really the origins of the strategic relationship. Also, as I said, the idea that they came to realize that the idea of the State Department Arabists that if the United States pressured Israel, that this would bring about peace, they came to understand was complete nonsense. That they wouldn't be satisfied with anything but the destruction of Israel. The U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia went to Eisenhower and said, the Saudis want peace. They have a peace plan, let me show it to you. And Eisenhower looked at the peace plan and he said, the peace plan of the Saudis is to destroy Israel. So this turned into a complete about face. And so when you look at the Eisenhower administration, after following the Arab lobby playbook of beating up on Israel, forcing them to withdraw by using all of our political, military, economic pressure to impose sanctions on the Israelis, by trying to befriend Arab leaders. Instead, relations with the Arabs actually grew worse. The Soviets, who we were trying to keep out of the Middle East, actually got a foothold in the region. Egypt joined the Soviet camp in one of the biggest defeats for our policy. The Saudis were obstructing our initiatives. We had to send U.S. troops in to save the Arabs. One of the things that the people who are critics of Israel are always suggesting, that the United States has to go in and save Israel, when in fact American troops have never had to fight for the Israelis. They have in fact had to fight for the Arabs on numerous occasions, and also had to fight specifically for the Saudis. And in the end, the failure to insist on a quid pro quo from the Egyptians when Israel was forced to withdraw from the Sinai ultimately was one of the catalysts for the '67 war. Let's look at the Obama policy briefly. I believe that basically Obama, as we saw from the comment I just mentioned a minute ago from David Jones, adopted the Arab lobby playbook again, from the influence of whether it's Arab lobby Arabists in the State Department, some of the Arab lobby lobbyists from Saudi Arabia and other places, some of his acquaintances before he became president, whether it's all a lot of his own personal views. It's not clear exactly what has informed him to become to adopt this Arabist perspective, but what did he try to do? What were his objectives, whether you like Obama or not? What did he want to do as president? Well, number one, as you know, he ran to be the anti-Bush. On domestic and foreign policy, his policy was going to be the opposite of George Bush. And in terms of Middle East policy, one of the things that meant was that the Arabs perceived George W. Bush as Israel's lawyer, that he was so biased in favor of Israel that they really didn't trust the United States policy. And so Obama wanted to change that and show that he was not going to be Israel's lawyer. He wanted to show that he was going to be a friend of the Arab and Islamic world. That the perception, again, in the Middle East was that George W. Bush was hostile to Arabs and Muslims, and we had to dramatically reverse that policy. He subscribed to the basic Arabist belief that if we make the Arab leaders happy, they will be more likely to cooperate with us on broader issues in the Middle East, peace, and Iran in particular. He also believed that you needed to solve the Palestinian issue, that this was the core of the problem in the Middle East, and that the best way to solve it was to put pressure on the Israelis. And finally, related to that is the idea that the United States has to be engaged in the Middle East, in Middle East policy making, and so he immediately jumped into the whole the Israeli-Palestinian peace process to try to jumpstart it out of the belief that if you don't engage, bad things happen in the vacuum. So those were what he was trying to do. Now let's see what he actually achieved. Number one, he wanted to make friends with the Arab world, the Muslim world, so he gave this wonderful speech in Cairo. I thought it was a great speech. But what was wrong with it? What was wrong was it was in Cairo, where you have Mubarak, an autocratic leader, who represses Muslims. So in much of the Muslim world and the Arab world, the perception wasn't, oh boy, this guy's completely different. Look at he wants to be friends with us. The perception, I believe, more was, this guy's just like all the rest. He's perfectly happy to support a dictator as long as he's pro-American. And so if you look at some of the polls that Pew has done, Obama is definitely more popular than George Bush, but he's still very unpopular in the Muslim world. The second thing, how many people know where he stopped on the way to Cairo? Hardly anyone knows because the administration purposely didn't publicize it. On the way to Cairo, he went to Riyadh to meet with King Abdullah. And basically he said to King Abdullah, look, I'm pressuring the Israelis now. I'm focused on this Palestinian-Israeli issue. I'm supporting the creation of a Palestinian state. Now I need you to support my policy. And one of the ways I want you to support my policy is to make some gestures to Israel that will show that if Israel makes peace with the Palestinians, there can be a broader peace throughout the Middle East. And King Abdullah said, jump in the lake. And over the next year and a half, there were a number of different meetings with various Saudi officials where they had similar kinds of discussions, and it got to be so absurd that at the end of the first year, they were asking Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states to let Israel fly over their countries. You know, Israel can't fly over Saudi Arabia. Their planes can't fly over. So the idea was that if Israel could fly 30,000 feet over Saudi Arabia, boy, they would give up that West Bank in a minute. It was completely ridiculous. And it didn't matter because what did the Saudis say? Jump in the lake. So he failed to, number one, win over the Arab Islamic world. Number two, he failed to win over the Arab states and Saudis in particular for support for the peace process. Third, what did he say off the bat? We need to impose, the Israelis have to impose a settlement freeze. Okay, I don't care if you like settlements, don't like settlements. What was the result of that policy? Well, one is it made Israelis completely lose faith in Obama. Israeli public opinion polls showed at one point that 4% of Israelis believed that Obama was a friend of Israel. Now, Obama may in fact be a great friend of Israel, but if Israelis don't believe it, they are not going to take risks for peace with the Palestinians, because the only way Israel can take risks for peace is if it is confident that the United States is behind it and will support it with security guarantees. And so by insisting on the settlement freeze and losing the faith of the Israeli people, he undermined his own agenda of getting the Israelis to negotiate with the Palestinians. Secondly, the Palestinians, as some of you may know, never insisted on a settlement freeze before negotiations. Just a year before Obama came to power, they were negotiating with Ehud Olmert and in fact accepting that some Israeli settlements would be annexed. But when Obama said the settlements had to be frozen, Mahmoud Abbas was now in an impossible position. How could he be less pro-Palestinian, less anti-settlement than the President of the United States? And so he then insisted on a settlement freeze, something that he had never insisted on before, and he refused to negotiate. It wasn't for about 9.5 months until he finally agreed, after a lot of pressure was put on him, to sit down with the Israelis, but as soon as he sat down, he said, I'm going to get right back up and leave if the settlement freeze doesn't continue. And the Israelis didn't continue the freeze, so the negotiations stopped. The other problem with the call for a settlement freeze was, what did the Israelis actually do? They froze settlements for 10 months, but not all settlement building, not in Jerusalem. So what did that do? A couple of things. One, the fact that Obama insisted on settlement freeze in Jerusalem killed any chance he had of support from the pro-Israel community, or American Jews, or Israelis. Because many Israelis, many American Jews don't like settlements, and they might have been willing to give him some slack over a freeze of settlements in the West Bank. But insisting on freezing in Jerusalem crossed a red line for most American Jews and for virtually all Israelis. And so there was almost no support for that. And the Israeli government refused to do it. That sent another message to the Arab world, which is, this Obama guy, he's actually not so different from the others. He's too weak to force the Israelis to do what needs to be done from their perspective. So if he's too weak, we don't need to support him, or we can't have faith in him. And you hear that a lot now. Finally, Obama seemed to recognize what just about everybody else recognized, which was his policy had been a complete failure to meet his own objectives. And what did he do? He brought in Dennis Ross, who had been isolated by the State Department Arabists to try to keep him out of Middle East policy making. He was supposed to do Iran originally. He was brought into the White House after the meeting in Riyadh because Obama was so furious that his advisors had given him the impression that the Saudis would go along with his policies. So he brought in Ross, who is not an Arabist, who is viewed in Israel as more sympathetic to them. And he tried to recalibrate policy from, instead of beating Israel with sticks, to offering them carrots. And the carrots they were offering, maybe you remember, in the fall was they were going to give them Israel a variety of new arms. They were making certain promises on votes at the UN and other political, economic, military incentives in exchange for Israel freezing the settlements for another 3 months. Well, it was a terrible policy still, because it made no sense. If Israel would have frozen settlements for another 3 months, the Palestinians could have walked out after 2.5 months and said, we're not coming back again unless you free settlements again. It would have gone on forever. And still, the Israelis were considering it, but in the end, I think foolishly, they didn't accept the incentives that they were offered, and I think angered Obama by doing so. But that basically is where we are today, that there's still an effort to recalibrate policy. There's a recognition, at least in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian issue, that the original Arabist approach wasn't going to work and isn't going to work. But now they're sidetracked entirely by the Egyptian issue, which, depending on how it goes, can completely change the entire strategic picture in the Middle East. If it goes in the worst case, we go back to the 1950s situation where the United States has only 3 allies, really, Israel, Jordan, assuming Jordan can survive, and the Gulf states. The Arabist perspective, I think, also can be seen in the Egyptian situation. That is, the Arabists have said for years that what we need to do is prop up the Mubarak regime because he's a friend. How do we keep him friendly? We give the Egyptians all the arms the generals want. Well, the Egyptians faced no external threats. They didn't need F-15s and tanks and all of our most modern equipment. What they needed was economic aid to feed the people, employ them, clothe them. And I would suggest that part of the reason for the disaffection in Egypt is the fact that we had a misappropriation of foreign aid in such a way that the military was getting supported and the people weren't, and created at least part of the conditions that we see today. That's how I see it. I'll give you your chance to argue now.
Thank you very much. You don't have to stand up, you can sit.
Thanks.
Yeah, let's start.
Yeah, go ahead.
Please.
Thank you for this great lecture. You know, I think in recent years, you will see the emerging two issues. And I'm speaking here from a kind of Arabian perspective. The Iranian perspective, the Iranian force, and what is happening in Egypt and Tunisia, the sweeping, democracy. How does these forces will reshape the course of lobbying here? I think, we need to be a little bit, projected in the future to see what will happen with the lobbying. And I like your thinking here that is really the splitter, groups in I think, while I was in Israel, I thought that the Shiite and the Sunnite are the same block. But when I came to the United States, the distrust between the two groups is much bigger than the Arab and the Israeli group. And these two forces, just like, how they will influence the path of lobbying here.
Well, it's a good question. I don't think, in terms of lobbying, first of all, outside the Saudis, the Arab states have very weak lobbies. The Egyptian lobby, for example, basically is fairly weak, and the main reason Egypt gets aid and support is because of the pro-Israel lobby, which supports aid to Egypt. But again, it depends partially on what happens in Egypt, but in most of these countries, you're going to have conservative forces are controlling the lobbies. So the Saudi monarchy is going to be controlling what gets said to the administration here and what they lobby for, and what they're lobbying for, and I think it's in the headline of the paper today, is to support Mubarak and to support the conservative regimes. They don't want any regime change. Jordan, I'm sure, is doing the same. The Israeli pro-Israel lobby, I suspect, is also suggesting that change is not necessarily good. One of the problems that the United States faces is what I call the democracy paradox. We have this paradox. On the one hand, America can't come out and say we are not for democracy and freedom. We're for continued dictatorship in Egypt or anywhere else. But on the other hand, we don't believe just in a democratic process that leads to a non-democratic result. So that if we say we want elections and then the elections bring to power a Islamic theocracy that enslaves the people, that's not what we're looking for either. George W. Bush had this case study where he was the first one to say he was going to end what's called the democracy exception. The United States has crusaded for democracy all over the world except the Middle East. It's the only place where we say the Saudis, the Jordanians, the Egypt, they can all be non-democrats. We don't care as long as they're pro-American. It's the only place in the world where we really do that. George W. Bush said he was going to change that, and the first place he tried to change it was the Palestinian Authority. And he insisted that there would be this free and fair election in the Palestinian Authority. What happens? Hamas wins the election, Hamas takes over Gaza, and Hamas is hardly a democracy in Gaza. People are much worse off, I would suggest. On the other hand, one of the benefits to dictatorship is, from the perspective of the interest in Middle East peace, is dictators can make peace. They don't have to ask permission. How many people believe that if Anwar Sadat put to a vote whether to have peace with Israel, it would have won? He didn't ask. He just did it. The same with King Hussein in Jordan. And so why aren't we calling for a revolt in Syria to bring down the Assad regime? Well, in part because we know if Assad ever decides he's going to make peace, he can actually do it. This also was manifest in our policy towards the Palestinians and Abbas. Again, Bush was doing what Americans believe in. He said the Palestinians must be transparent, but they must have political reforms. All the things that we're saying to Egypt now, we said to the Palestinian Authority when Arafat was still the president. And then what happened? Mahmoud Abbas becomes the prime minister, and he's now, before Abbas, Yasser Arafat stole $900 million of international aid, and what did he do with it? He didn't build himself a palace like Saddam Hussein. He used it to pay off 40,000 militia people to be loyal to him. So he had this army. So if Arafat had ever made peace, decided to make peace, he could have done it because he controlled everything. Now we go to Mahmoud Abbas and we say, you can't do that. You have to be transparent. You can't be corrupt. So now he has no money to pay the 40,000 militiamen. So then when Hamas tries to take over Gaza, Abbas picks up the phone, calls his 40,000 man army and says, go stop those Hamas guys, and they hang up the phone. You didn't pay us. So it was a paradox that in trying to support more openness in the Palestinian Authority, we actually undermined the possibility for Abbas to first stave off Hamas and ultimately, I think, to make peace. So, but in terms of lobbying, there is no, I don't see any emergence of some grassroots lobby that's all going to be lobbying Congress to support democracy throughout the Middle East.
Yes. Well, let me say, I agree with almost everything you said.
Stop there.
But, okay. No, but isn't there one issue that you might want to go into further? When you talk about the limited appeal that these groups have domestically, because they're considered anti-Israel and Congress basically won't listen to them. Don't you think that the Saudis may have tried an end run around that by J Street now, with started by someone who was involved with Saudi lobbying to begin with, Ben Ami, and claiming now to be pro-Israel and yet adopting the anti-Israel stances as a way, and you notice, I'm sure, that there's some Saudi financing of J Street, significant, even though Ben Ami won't tell you how much it is, that maybe they are trying to fill in that gap and create an organization, or had a hand in creating an organization that can go to Congress and say, we're pro-Israel, but do all these things that are basically anti-Israel. So another thing that you might look into in your next book.
Well, look, J Street is nothing new. There have been organizations that were opposed to Zionism and the State of Israel from the beginning. And the State Department always used them. They would say, look, even these Jews agree with us. We can't be anti-Semitic, we can't be anti-Israel. Even the Jews agree with us. And they would find, 3 Jews or some marginal organization
but never
with no
a group
representation.
That claimed to be pro-Israel.
Well, now you have, look, J Street, as far as I can tell, has zero influence over anything. They have, almost all of their money came from apparently some woman in Hong Kong and Soros. And in terms of actual policies, I don't see a single policy on which they've had any influence. And I can't imagine that they're likely to have any influence, because they basically adopted another Arabist point of view. And that is one of the Arab lobby cardinals of faith, which was best expressed in a famous article by George Ball, the former Undersecretary of State, which was How to Save Israel. The article was called How to Save Israel in Spite of Itself. And basically the J Street philosophy is that the Israelis are too stupid, too naive, too immature, too politically constrained to do what's good for them. We, American Jews sitting in Chevy Chase, Maryland, know what's best for Israel, and therefore the United States should force Israel to do what we think is good for them. And this is the State Department officials who at least also say that they're sympathetic to Israel, that's their position also, that the Israelis don't know what's good for them, they don't know what's good for the United States, we have to tell them what's good for them. We have to force them to do what's good for them. And it's nothing new, and generally that point of view has not been persuasive.
I have two questions. One considers the personal relations and interests of some people in the political class in the United States and Saudi Arabia. I think it was in Michael Moore's movie that he showed the financial interests of people, including the Bush family and the Saudi Arabians. Did you find anything in your research on that?
Well,
and the second question is from the other side of the political coin, and that is, don't you see the now it's the Arab League initiative, but the Saudi initiative as a very positive step towards the solution of the conflict, against the analysis that they are not looking for any?
Well, let me deal with the finance question first. One of the things that is interesting is the attitude toward the Saudis is bipartisan, completely bipartisan. The only U.S. president who was ever willing to stand up to the Saudis was John F. Kennedy, who in 1962, if I remember correctly, told the Saudis they had to abolish slavery. 100 years after our Civil War, the Saudis still had legal slavery. Kennedy said it has to stop, and they stopped, which showed me that a determined American president can't force the Saudis to give up something, even if they say this is part of our tradition or part of our faith or part of whatever. We could do it, but he's the only one. Now, in terms of the financing, one of the things that influence, one of the reasons that there are so many Arabists who are supportive of the Saudis is Prince Bandar has this great quote where he said basically, if you take care of people after they leave government, you'd be surprised how good a friend they are when they're in government. And so what that means is if you are sympathetic to the Saudis when you're in the State Department, you have a good chance of getting a job at a think tank, working as a consultant for an oil company or for some Saudi consultancy. And you look at the names, and there are tons of them. So that's an incentive. There's also the simple incentive to become more of an Arabist by the fact that there are 21 different places you can get a job. What language do you study if you want to get a job in the State Department? Well, one of the best would be Arabic, not Hebrew. If you study Hebrew, you can go to exactly one country. You study Arabic, you can go to 21 states and think of how many people are in each embassy, and they're rotating to those different embassies, and over time you have this tremendous number of people who have an affinity for the Arab world, and sometimes it goes over the line to what we call in the field clientitis, where they represent the Arab state more than their own government. We had the case, for example, of the ambassador to Saudi Arabia that Henry Kissinger fired because they said he was he represented the Saudis more than the United States. He was actually, during the oil embargo, telling U.S. oil companies how they could better enforce the embargo against their own country. You had Chaz Freeman, who now goes around attacking Israel and the Israeli lobby all the time, was considered also a guy who, by James Baker, hardly a great member of the Israeli lobby, as someone who had clientitis when he didn't want the Saudis to have to pay the bill for our troops saving their lives in the first Gulf War. So, and in terms of the president, you look at the Saudis, it's not, everybody looks at the Bush family because they had close ties with the Saudis through the oil. But every administration had close ties with the Saudis. They all did. And the Saudis give money to all their presidential libraries. They give money to the First Lady's causes. My favorite story was there's this obscure Southern governor who went to the Saudis and said, I would like you to give money for a program in Middle East studies at the University of Arkansas. The Saudis must have looked at him and said, you gotta be kidding me. Well, not long afterwards, that obscure Southern governor becomes the Democratic candidate for president, and lo and behold, the Saudis give $3.5 million to the University of Arkansas. Then that obscure governor, Bill Clinton, becomes the president, and shortly after his inauguration, he calls up the king and says, remember, I have that interest in the University of Arkansas, and shortly thereafter, $20 million ends up at the University of Arkansas. So this is the way the Saudis operate. This is the way they operated to take over their country. How did the Saud family take over Saudi Arabia? They did it the old-fashioned way. They married everybody, and they bought everybody off. Why isn't there the kind of Egyptian revolt in Saudi Arabia? Because everybody's making money. So many people are princes and so many people are getting cuts of these $60 billion arms deal. There's much less incentive to revolt there. The Saudi peace plan. Basically, I think the Saudi peace plan was a complete phony public relations ploy. When did the Saudis launch their peace plan?
After 15 of the 19 bombers.
Exactly, a few months after 9/11, when everybody was focused on the Saudis as the source of terror in the Middle East. All of a sudden, the Saudis launch a peace plan. They're the great peacemakers. Everybody's talking about Saudis wanting to make peace. They did this before. When the AWACS were being debated in Congress, and the pro-Israel lobby had been very successful in lining up opposition to the sale of AWACS radar planes to the Saudis, and it looked like for the first time an arms sale to the Saudis was going to be defeated. King Fahd came out with a peace plan. And guess what? Then the president was able to go to Congress and say, look, our friends the Saudis, they're with us, they're in favor of peace. Right after the arms sale passed, King Fahd turned around and talked about a jihad to liberate Jerusalem and went back to all the anti-Israel rhetoric from before the arms sale. In terms of the Saudi, for me, there's a simple test of the Saudi peace plan. You correct me which prime minister it was. If it was Olmert or Sharon, said, okay, let's negotiate the peace plan. You come to Jerusalem or I'll go to Riyadh. And the Saudis said, forget it. To me, that's the simple test. If they had any sincerity whatsoever about the peace plan, they would invite the Israelis to Riyadh or some other location of their choosing, or they would go to Jerusalem. Instead, they say, I forget which official said, King Abdullah will never go to Jerusalem.
Well, not only that, they said it was non-negotiable. Amr Moussa said that immediately after the Beirut conference.
Well, they said there are problems with the terms of it. They also basically said, what kind of a peace offer is it when you say, if you don't accept exactly what we've offered you, we're going to go to war against you. So I just find no sincerity behind it, and the precedents showing that it's unlikely. And even you look at State Department Erebus, again in the documents you find them say the last country that would ever make peace with Israel is Saudi Arabia. It's the most anti-Semitic country. So just a couple of years ago on their website, they had reminded you of the United States in the 50s when they had signs, no Jews, no dogs allowed. They had on the website for applying for a visa to Saudi Arabia, no Jews allowed, until it was brought to the attention of Congress, and then they had to take it down. Actually, one of the kings, I forget if it was Faisal, who said that when he visited San Francisco back in the 50s, he thought the greatest thing was seeing those signs saying no Jews and no dogs. So the Saudis, I just find to have no credibility with on the peace issue. You had a question?
All right. Oh, sorry.
Yes, a quick question regarding, I guess, the oil that Saudi Arabia has. I mean, oil is a non-renewable resource, and I'm sure there are limited quantities. How much oil does Saudi Arabia still have?
It's a good question, since there was just a story in the paper yesterday saying the Saudis were overestimating the amount that they had. But when I was in college, at your age, everyone was saying that we were going to run out of oil before the year 2000. The last estimate I saw before this story about the Saudis overestimating said the Saudis were saying they had at least 80 years worth of oil left. So yes, it's a finite resource. I don't think anybody knows how long it will last. But the Saudis are smart. Saudis are very smart. Don't for a second think that I'm demeaning the Saudis at all. They're extremely smart. And one of the things, they basically outsmarted the United States, I think, over the years. And they understand that oil is a finite resource. So what are they investing in? Solar. They invest in natural gas. They have the largest reserves, I think, of natural gas. They invest in some alternative technologies. Now they want to invest in nuclear, although I don't think it has anything to do with energy. so they understand that they have to manage their resource carefully and take advantage while they can. If you saw that, what was the movie with George Clooney? Syriana, I think he sort of expresses it very well there. Someone look.
My question's on the title of your book. It gives an impression that there is this unified Arab lobby, but based on your presentation, you divide it into two halves, the Saudi lobby and the domestic lobby. But the Saudi lobby, it sounds like, is a lot more effective than the domestic lobby. That is, like you said, divided. There's not, a common denominator that unites all of them. And so my question is, that there seems to be an inconsistency, and it seems like the title is a little deceiving in terms of it. And so I'm just wondering why you chose to call this the Arab lobby when there actually doesn't seem to be a unified thread between them.
I guess I could have called it the Arab lobbies.
Or why not call it the Saudi lobby?
Well, because looking at it academically, it's not just the Saudis are not the only lobby. They're by far the most influential, but the Arab American or the domestic side of the lobby dates back to the 20s and 51 when King Saud asked the United States, and ultimately the CIA helped fund the creation of an Arab lobby. They are trying to influence policy. So it may be that, as I argue, that they're not very successful, but I think it's important to document who they are and what they do, and why they are largely, or have been largely, unsuccessful now. But they're involved, they're very active in lobbying. So, I think if people would have said, why did you ignore the American Task Force for Palestine, or why did you ignore the Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, or any of the other organizations lobbying on behalf of Arab interests? Go ahead.
You pointed out, which of course was correct, that the State Department in the 40s was very Arab oriented. I wonder if you could name some of the people in the current administration who you feel are Arabists in the sense you were talking about it. Also, do you see a difference or a difference between the groups lobbying on Arab behalf, say American Task Force for Palestine on one end, and the BDS people and beyond on the other, or do you see them as more or less the same?
Well, I think certainly there are distinguishing characteristics for different organizations. The American Task Force for Palestine has staked out a position that's far more moderate than historically most of the Arab lobby organizations have taken. I'm not sure that they're particularly sympathetic to Israel, but they favor a two-state solution. They've been openly critical of Hamas, which is something that's quite unusual. So yeah, there's a difference, I think, between the different organizations, and partly because of that, the task force has had greater credibility than a lot of the organizations in the past that were just so far on the extreme that they were usually dismissed by most politicians. I think the BDS people are an entirely different category. Boycott, discrimination, sanctions advocates basically are people who don't believe in the right of Israel to exist, if you look at the history of the movement and what the people who advocate it say. So I think they're very different, but they're not lobbying the government, and nobody's paying any attention to them. But there are other groups that one of the things I argue, that even though the domestic lobby hasn't been very influential, they've become much more respected and have much greater access than they ever did. That it was not so long ago, it wasn't until the late 70s when Arab Americans would get invited anywhere, or where any U.S. government official of any significance would ever speak to their conferences. Now you get the Secretary of State, top officials go to these different organizations' conferences. They have an open door. Obama has met with a number of them. So I think they've grown in stature and in respectability, but it hasn't translated up until now into major policy. In terms of individuals, I don't know if I can think of any offhand. The names and faces I don't do well, but David Jones, clearly as the former national security advisor, comes across as someone who's one of those people who had an Arabist orientation. It's still not entirely clear to me, to be honest, who's had the most influence on Obama, how much of the State Department individuals are influencing his policy, how much of it's already his own personal beliefs. One of the things someone told me about his relationship with Clinton, for example, and I have no way of verifying it, but basically they said that Obama pays no attention to Clinton whatsoever on the Middle East because he basically feels he knows more than she does. Whether that translates below her to other members of the State Department, it's hard to say. But usually, usually it's the ambassadors of the different countries who tend to be Arabists. And it's not always in a pejorative way, but sometimes. But I can't think of a particular name offhand.
I was wondering what a Saudi audience or an Arab American audience, how they might respond to your presentation. Have you presented it?
If they invite me, I'll let you know. No, they're going to. I'm sure they won't agree. I mean, first of all, they're going to focus on the Israeli lobby, which they believe is all powerful and all influential. I think even one of the people I quote toward the end of the book, Hussein Ibish, who's sort of a stalwart member of the Arab lobby, went to give a lecture in the Gulf and basically said all these organizations have no influence. I mean, again, don't look at it as I'm a political scientist. Look at it in terms of objective measures. Look at the legislative agenda of the Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee or any of these organizations, and just look: has any of that legislation been adopted? How many votes do they? I mean, they consider a great victory if they get 20 or 30 votes on an issue that loses 300 to 30 or something like that, or 300 whatever to 30. So, when I wrote my dissertation, I wrote this sort of bifurcated dissertation because I had this committee where I had one guy who was an Israel expert who couldn't find a econometric model or a regression if he fell over it, and on one of my other advisors couldn't find Israel on the map, but insisted I have lots of regression analysis. So I actually went through and I charted I think more than 1,000 Middle East policy decisions, and I ran regression analysis to show what issues or what variables had the most influence on Middle East policy. And basically my finding, and I combined this with some case studies, and I think this is true in general, but U.S. Middle East policy, the most important thing is the president's ideology. If you know what the president believes, you look at their religious beliefs, you look at their beliefs in terms of freedom, democracy, the Bible, all of those things, and you can figure out what they believe, then the advisor whose advice on any given issue is closest to their ideology is going to have the most influence. That's the most important factor. The other important factor is, where is the decision made? If the decision is made in Congress, then lobbies have more influence. But even then, I found that they have very little. They only have influence over economic issues, primarily. So if you talk about foreign aid, yes, the Israeli lobby helps get foreign aid through every year. But what else do they get passed? And one of the interesting things, I gave a paper last year on waivers, presidential waivers. Israel, the pro-Israel lobby will get some legislation adopted to move the embassy to Jerusalem, for example, or to prevent the Palestinian Liberation Organization from having a mission in Washington. It's great. They'll get huge vote in favor of this legislation. and they'll trumpet this great success. But read the legislation. All of these pieces of legislation that are political usually have a waiver that says if the president decides that this is not in the interest, national security interest of the United States, he can ignore it. Every 6 months he has to say this is against our policy. So you had Bill Clinton say, I'm going to move the embassy of America to Jerusalem. Then you had George Bush, I'm going to move the embassy. Then you had Obama, I don't think he said he'd move the embassy, but he supported the United Capital of Jerusalem for 1 day before he got pressured to change his mind after the AIPAC conference. But where's the embassy of the United States? Tel Aviv. Because every 6 months the president says it's not in the national security interest to move the embassy. And the same with the PLO mission, and there's a handful of other ones. And it's interesting because I traced the first example of this I could find, and it goes back to my discussion, was in 1959, 8 or 9, I think 9. A Senator Wayne Morse from Oregon, I think, wanted to pass a resolution that said we would cut off aid to any country that discriminated on the basis of religion. And the basis, the reason for the resolution was because the Saudis were discriminating against American Jews, and also blacks, African Americans, in Saudi Arabia. And so it was really meant to cut off aid to the Saudis. And there was this senator named John F. Kennedy who said we needed to have a waiver, and he put a waiver in so that from that day until today, the Saudis can discriminate against Americans and we won't do anything about it. And in fact, the State Department would say, we shouldn't say anything about that. We don't want to rock the boat.
I haven't read yet the book.
Was my question in the back. Go ahead.
Go ahead, yeah.
I just wanted to know that because Iranian doesn't have any politics lobby in the U.S. as far as we know.
Who does?
Iranian.
Iran, okay.
All right, yeah. So how is things going on? Because they play a big role in the Palestine and the Hamas thing. And then you said about the Arab lobbies, or the Saudi lobbies in here, and how they influence the decisions on Israel and all this stuff. So where it comes to the Iranian role in playing this game.
Well, there are some groups that lobby about Iran, but they are small and marginal. It's more the people who are active on the Iranian issues now tend to be the pro-Israel lobby that's most concerned about what's going on in Iran. Plus the basic, I think a lot of the foreign policy establishment that sees dangers from Iran's nuclear program. But there isn't a really strong pro-Iranian or anti-Iranian lobby, for that matter, of Iranian Americans that I know of. There are a lot of Iranians in the United States, and I think they act more through other organizations. Like, for example, there are lots of Iranian Jews in the United States. I don't think lobby as Iranian Jews, or as Iranians, they lobby as part of the pro-Israel community, for example. But I didn't really look at Iran. It's not an Arab country. I didn't look at them as closely. So there may be things I don't know about them. But as far as I know, there's no strong lobby either for or against them of Iranians. It's more others concerned with the issues in general.
Are there any other questions? If not, I'll ask you the last one, which is very related to that one. Did you deal with Muslim lobby or only the Arab lobby? Or if you didn't deal with the Muslim, can you say something about that issue in the United States?
Well, it's interesting. There was this study that came out from Pew, I think, the other day, talking about the Muslim population growth, and it was going to become, I forget what the percentage was of world population, and then it was going to become, I forget what the number was in the United States now, 6 or 10 million, whatever. First of all, we don't have good numbers on the number of Muslim Americans in the United States. The Muslim American groups grossly exaggerate. They say 8, 10 million. Most of the researchers have said it's more like 1.5 to 3 million, probably 2 or 3 million. The other thing, just like I was talking about the Arab American community being very diverse, the Muslim American community is even more diverse maybe because you have all of the different countries where Muslims come from, whether it's Indonesia or India or Pakistan, and they don't also belong to the Arab lobby. Typically they're not interested in the Palestinian issue, they're not lobbying on behalf of it, they're interested in their own issues, India-Pakistan issues or whatever the particular issue is. So there are some people who have this fear of a Muslim lobby or Muslim influence in America. I don't see there being some sort of big political threat or political movement from the Muslim American community, in part because it's very small, it's very diverse, with a very wide range of views. But there are Muslim American organizations that are part of the Arab lobby that do lobby on behalf of the Palestinian issue primarily, that have gotten money from the Saudis. The Muslim American organizations tend to be more sympathetic to Hamas than to Fatah. So that creates divisions between the Muslim American groups and the more Palestinian American groups. And that further weakens the lobby. I mean, all of this division among themselves is one of the things that contributes to their weakness. Now, just one thing, I don't for a second, the Walter Mearsheimer and a lot of the critics of the Israeli lobby suggest that it's illegitimate, they shouldn't be allowed to do what they're doing, they're undermining America. I don't believe that's the case. The Arab lobby, as long as they follow the rules, they follow the law, they are perfectly entitled to lobby for whatever interest they have. They just haven't been as persuasive so far. You have a debate, there's a winner and a loser. And the fact that one side wins doesn't mean doesn't necessarily mean anything other than their argument's better and more persuasive. And I think what frustrates Walter Mearsheimer and a lot of the Arabists is that their arguments haven't persuaded the people who make the decisions, or haven't persuaded the American public. So I think the competition will continue, and you'll continue to see the Arab lobby win some, it loses some, just as the Israeli lobby wins some and loses some.
Fine, thank you very much. Whoever wants to buy the book outside, how much is the...
I think,
I don't know how much.